Great. Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Toby Williams. I'm the Development Manager for the East team, part of the Joint Planning Service. I'm the chair of this meeting, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's briefing. The briefing allows councillors to see and understand an emerging long-term management and governance proposal for the Burnside Lakes at Coldham's Lane, part of the proposed delivery of an urban country park and part of a live planning application for R&D uses on land allocated adjacent, known as land south of Coldham's Lane. The briefing will be led by Mission Street, Stantec and their appointed consultants in this field of expertise, community stewardship solutions, and it will be structured, as is typically the case, with a 20 to 30 minute slot for a presentation, followed by a 20 to 30 minute slot for questions. We can go slightly over if necessary. In a moment, I will ask the developer team to introduce themselves, but first some housekeeping. This meeting is being recorded and councillors should treat the meeting as a public meeting. The meeting is specifically for councillors, albeit members of the public are entitled to listen into the briefing. The details of the meeting can be subject to a freedom of information request or similar, and the video recording of the meeting will be posted on the council's YouTube channel. Can I ask all participants to keep themselves muted and to keep your backgrounds blurred unless you are invited to speak? I think there is some interference from someone at the moment I can hear. If councillors would like to ask a question or get the attention of chair, please raise your virtual hand in Teams. We will deal with questions after the presentation has finished. Members of planning committee should not express a firm opinion upon any aspect of today's presentation which might give rise to a view that you have a closed mind to the proposal. However, please don't feel stifled in raising issues and concerns that you foresee arising from the proposal to aid discussion. The recording of the meeting will be available for 6 months from today's date. Okay, so if members and officers could turn off their cameras, and I'll ask the developer team to introduce yourselves, please, and begin your presentation. Stuart, if I could hand over to you, that would be great. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Toby. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name's Stuart Kane. I am Development Director of Mission Street. We're excited to be here today to talk you through our thoughts on bringing forward what I think is one of the most exciting parts of the application, and that's the creation of the urban country park in particular, with reference to parcels B and C. Obviously, as developer and landowner of Parcel A, we're the lead for the application, but it's a slightly unusual position in terms of we have 3 parcels of land, and obviously Parcel B is wholly owned by Andersons, and then Parcel C is owned Andersons and the local authority. So the nature of how we try to pull this together and look at strategies for management and future funding are more complex than usual, but I think actually do provide lots of exciting opportunities. And with that, I just want to hand over to Tim to introduce from Andersons. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Stuart. Hi, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces and names. My name's Tim Chilvers. I'm the Operations Director at Anderson. And as Stuart says, we are the sole owner of Parcel B and part owner of the lakes. So, yeah, very pleased to be here and I look forward to the discussion. I think with that, I'll hand over to Richard, if I may.
Morning, everyone. Richard Mowing, Associate Director in the planning team at Stantec. I'm the planning advisor to Mission Street on the project. I'll hand over to Andrew.
Morning, everybody. Andy Fisher. I'm a planning partner at David Locke Associates, assisting on the planning side on this project with Stuart and others. Dan, do you want to?
Yep. Morning, everybody. Daniel Ray, Director at Periscope. We are working on behalf of Mission Street on the landscape and public realm design and coordinating the landscape design across all 3 parcels. And I'm going to hand over to Colin.
Morning all, my name's Colin Noble from Chess Engage. We work with Mission Street on engaging with the community and some of the stakeholders around the lakes.
All right, and I'm Mark Patchett, Specialist Consultant in Stewardship and Placemaking, and working for both Mission Street and for Anderson.
Great. Okay, Mark. So I think you've got a presentation for us. If you want to start that presentation, that would be fantastic.
Right, that's fine. People see that?
Yeah,
All good.
That's up. Thanks. Yeah.
Good. Okay. So, right. So it's over to me. Yep. Are you ready for me to go? Stuart, is that okay? Fine. Okay. Well, thank you everybody, obviously, for this opportunity. To talk about our particular focus is the management and funding framework. So what I want to do over the next 20 minutes or so is to set out the introduction to this. I'll hand over to Dan, who will cover off site context and the ambition for parcels B and C. And then I'll pick up on the key areas that we've engaged on this, which is about the roles and responsibilities with regard to stewardship, the costs, the funding solution, and the long-term governance arrangements around responsibility and participation, and then touch on a couple of thoughts around next steps. So just a quick way of introduction to this. I'm here today. My other colleagues, I'm afraid, are unavailable today. But just to let you know, we've been working on the project. So I've been leading a company called Community Stewardship Solutions, around 35 years experience. But 2 of my colleagues working on this particular assignment. So Mark Dodson, his background is financial management. He's recently come from Otterpool. Some of you might know is a 10,000 unit scheme down at Folkestone. He was the finance director down there. And Luke Iswini, his specialism is landscape management, and particularly on the costing side of it and implementing landscape solutions. And he's done all the preparation around the cost side, which we'll share with you shortly. Just a little bit more background, just so you understand a bit about our experience. As I said, we've been doing this sort of work for 35 years, and our specialism is actually on major stewardship solution or bespoke stewardship solutions on major development sites. Most of our work is for units and sizes of 2,000 upwards. The biggest and most comparable site probably is around Ebbsfleet. Some of you might know Ebbsfleet Development Corporation. There's 15,000 units they're building out there, but the reason it's comparable is because there are various lakes there. 3 already now live and in operation at what we call the major urban park area, but also been involved just recently with another called Blue Lake, a very deep lake, a quarry lake. So quite a lot of experience already in bringing forward stewardship solutions around that context. But also we've done a range of other projects, particularly around also stewardship for parks and nature reserves. More local one you might be familiar with. So we were advising, or I was advising, particularly Grosvenor, and working with the Wildlife Trust at Trumpington Meadows, and also just done another one fairly recently at Faversham Lakes over for Anderson. So a range of experiences which we're happy to draw on if it's helpful to you as we get into the meat of this. So the aims of what we were asked to do by the clients essentially is to bring forward the practical arrangements to make this work for the long term around particularly a significant new recreational resource that addresses the lack of publicly accessible open space at local level in this community. We wanted to ensure the landscape at Coldham's Lane develops in a manner that's commensurate with the original design intentions, and Dan will pick up those in a few moments for you to explain a bit more. And also, particularly, we're keen to support the objectives of Cambridge's Nature Recovery Network by securing the public open space through this corridor and creating a safe and clean environment, providing a high quality landscape. And then that last one, but equally importantly, ensuring the long-term management of the proposed landscape in an environmentally and financially sustainable and appropriate way. And that's a really important part of this. And I'll pick up on that in a few moments. So Dan, if I could hand over to you and just say next slide, and I'll pass on to the next slide when you're ready.
Sure, thanks, Mark. Hi again, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. Please stick your virtual hands up if you can't. I'm just going to spend perhaps 2 or 3 minutes rehearsing the policy context and the strategic design ambitions, just to set the scene before we get into some of the detail that Mark will take you through later on. So I think always important to start with policy, and just to remind ourselves that policy 16 of the Cambridge Local Plan requires the creation of a new urban country park. Our proposals across the 3 parcels A, B and C, we believe, are fully compliant with that. And that involves the opening of the areas marked A for public access, which you can see on the plan on the right where the cursor's hovering. It requires ecological enhancements and passive recreational access to B, which is, you can see on the plan on the right, and then the opening of the lakes themselves for passive recreational use. So that's the policy position, and that's what we are looking to deliver. Next slide, please. So I think probably important to remind ourselves that within the Cambridge Nature Recovery Strategy, this site sits within something that's emerging as the East Cambridge Ecological Corridor, and that runs, one could say, north to south or south to north from Coldham's Common, which is to the north of our site. It's the big blob to the north, if you like, and then through the lakes and down towards Cherry Hinton Chalk Pits, which is a protected ecological site. So the lakes themselves, and indeed all 3 parcels, form a kind of critical connection in that necklace of ecological connections that run through East Cambridge, and so it's really important that we deliver these and that they are maintained and stewarded in the best way possible to establish that ecological network. Next slide, please. So just to rehearse the wider master plan. So I'll start in the top of the slide. So Parcel B is ecologically protected, very limited access, looking to protect particularly fauna in there, both kind of slow worms and some of the butterfly population. And then Parcel C is the lakes, and that's obviously for recreation, protecting the ecology of the lakes as far as possible, or balancing that with human access and providing safe access. And then Parcel A, that's the site that is being brought forward for development, but we also view that as part of this ecological network. So we're looking for significant biodiversity net gain and landscape enhancements on that site as part of these 3 sites in a tripartite proposal. Next slide, please. So Parcel C, just to talk about what's happening there. Recreation, so significant new areas of public space, and areas for groups, local groups who are interested in ecology, and a controlled access to parts of the site to avoid public access damaging sensitive ecologies on sites. 4 new access points, 1 on Burnside and 3 on the Tins. And then establishment of chalk grassland. That's a nationally significant vegetation type. It's important that we recreate that as much as possible. Enhanced dense scrub for foraging fauna, and then particular interventions that relate to bats and reptiles across the site. And you can see some images of that on the right. Next slide, please. It hasn't moved on.
Sorry, trying to get it to move. Not sure why it won't. Sorry about that. Not sure why. I'm going to stop sharing and start again if I need to. Do apologise. Really sorry. Okay, let's do it again. So sorry.
We'll have at least one Teams issue in these meetings. There we are.
Okay, let's go back and start again. So next one, is it? Are we there now?
It is. Here we are.
Great. Okay,
Brilliant.
sorry about that. Okay, thank you.
And then just quickly, conscious of time, so Parcel B is about safeguarding ecological enhancement. So the creation of as much as much mosaic habitat as possible. That's effectively a patchwork of different ecological conditions to support as much biodiversity as possible. So including species-rich wildflower, grassland, scrub, and bare and recolonizing ground. This has been developed in concert with Mission Street's consulting ecologists, and also through pre-app with officers. And so the idea is that the selective access will be allowed here to look at the ecology, but generally speaking, it's not for public access. I think that's it from me. Mark, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Got the same issue again. What's happening? So sorry. I think what's happening every
Mark,
time I'm touching.
Do you want me to share and see if that?
If you can, you do that. I'll tell you what's happening. When I'm touching my mic on and off, it's then interfering with the sharing process. I don't know why. So I'm having to come out and come back in again. So yes, if you could, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So thanks very much, Dan. So what I want to get to now is talking about the management framework, which is the particular piece of work that we were asked to do. This is for parcels B and C, and I'm going to pick this off under three headings. So first of all, roles and responsibilities, because that must be the starting point to any management framework, about the long-term management and maintenance of both parcels B and C, and maintaining the rights of public access to parcel C, and also supporting learning and on-site practical opportunities to wildlife restoration, enhancement and management. Then I'm going to pick up around the funding, an appropriate funding mechanism to provide security for successor management bodies. And then I'm going to pick up on the governance and participation, and particularly about a management body to oversee and implement the stewardship strategy, around an advisory board, and making sure that in the event of failure, we've enabled continued management of both parcels. Next slide, please. So starting with the roles and responsibilities, as we said, we're picking up on parcels B and C. Now those fall into three headings. So first of all is what we've been discussing. It's the public open space management and maintenance. So the maintenance and management of those open spaces and the associated grounds maintenance, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second about some of the details. The second key role and responsibility required is around the financial management, about managing income and expenditure, maximising any income from endowment, and reserves, maintaining those reserves, including long-term sinking funds. And then, of course, you've also got the role around the community participation, enabling the community access and associated volunteering opportunities to build that sense of local ownership, and also supporting the sustained use by the fishing club. Next slide, please. Lou Kiswini, our cost consultant, used his experience to draw up a cost base to the long-term annual maintenance and sinking fund arrangements. I won't go into these line by line or any details, but just to show you, this is really here just to demonstrate the thinking that's gone into this. So we looked at the various aspects around literally the maintenance of those spaces, looking at fencing and gates and paths to make sure that they're maintained and there are sinking funds for their replacement. Also litter picking and ecology maintenance, and particularly the monitoring of that over the 30-year lifetime required. And that's for parcel B, but also then parcel C as well. Again, looking at the hard landscaping, soft landscaping, maintenance of those physical assets, and again, the litter picking. The material point I wanted to raise here is that we're looking at just under £30,000 per annum required to maintain those spaces, to maintain the standards that we're all looking forward and expecting going forward. Next slide, please. I won't pick off all these details, but just to say this is the background, just to show that this is not just my QS looking at it from his own perspective. What we've also done is drawn the experience from other related sites. There's often published tender costs from local authorities we've been picking up on. There's also recommended advice and costs from authoritative organisations such as Woodland Trust or Sports England. We've got data on grounds maintenance from other companies that we've been using, and also we benchmark unit costs to reflect the changes in the markets, and these have been uplifted, particularly, for example, in the recent cost changes due to minimum wage rises, which have had quite a big bearing on landscape management. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to the funding side of it, really what we need to look at is about those potential sources of income against the long-term cost headings. There are 5 long-term cost headings on the left-hand side we're looking at there. The first 3 we've already touched on: the maintenance of the public space, the maintenance and replacement of the hard landscaping and furniture and signage, and the ecological monitoring for the BNG over the 30 years. And also on top of that, we must look at the costs of communicating and community participation to support that, and of course the overall management coordination, including the commissioning of the landscape contractors. And the sources of income can come from 5 different sources. So initial startup funding, income from any endowment income that's endowed to the organisation, Cambridge City Council, if they feel appropriate to contribute into this, given obviously they own part of the land as well, or the lakes as well, any charitable grants, and any in-kind or practical support from the user and volunteer groups. And I'll mention that last one particularly because a key way, of course, to ensure that sense of ownership is through in-kind and practical support. And that's actually been the case up to now very much from the Fishing Club, who've very much taken that sense of ownership and contributed a lot of in-kind support. But of course, the other side, from your perspective as members, you need to make sure that this is maintained and looked after in the long run. And there's adequate resources there to ensure that that can be done properly and appropriately. Next slide, please. So essentially, the funding approach we've taken there is picked up the direct costs that we referred to earlier on for Parcel B and Parcel C. So that's just as said, those 2 numbers there, nearly £30,000. Added in then a 20% management fee, which allows for treasury management as well, nearly another 6,000, and then a contingency figure of 5%. So giving us a total of 37,794, nearly 38,000 is the baseline annual operating cost that we're anticipating here for these 2 spaces. And what we're then allowed for is said, well, OK, if you take that over a 30-year period, that's for the sites, that will require an endowment of about £900,000, which will then deliver the revenue stream required for that. But if one goes longer than that, and we say 30 years obviously required on Parcel B, but if one goes for Parcel C for 50 or 75 years, then this gives an endowment figure required at 1.1 million for 50 years or up to 1.3 million for 75 years. Next slide, please. And just to show you the assumption we've made here, so we've assumed a long-term annual inflation of 2.5%, current interest rates of 4.4%. And as I said, the ecologist mentioned for the first 30 years, having to do this for 1 to 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 and 30 years on Parcel B. Management fees, we've mentioned, contingency as discussed, but also allowing here as well for startup costs, which we're suggesting could be up to £50,000. For that's the legal advice to get this all set up and the corporate support and other things, really, and consultancy support to get this all going in the first place. So that's what's been allowed in these numbers, which from our experience we believe should be adequate for what's required here. Next slide, please. So far we've talked about roles and responsibilities, the funding requirements and how that's going to be met. I just want to talk now about governance, which is obviously equally important to this. It's about who's responsible, who takes ownership, who takes the decisions, and how do we ensure good community participation. So what we're after achieving here is, first of all, there are key requirements about fulfilling the ecological, recreational, maintenance and monitoring functions in the long term and managing off any risk for non-delivery to those standards expected. The second one, equally importantly, is around the finance and organisational capacity for both long-term owners and that day-to-day management, particularly with regard to managing what could be quite considerable sums here of circa £1 million or £1 million plus in terms of the endowment. And thirdly, they must be credible and acceptable to not just the City Council, but also those other local key stakeholders, particularly local residents and the Fishing Club. Next slide, please. And just unpicking that a bit further, there are sort of 8 requirements here that we're looking at. So safeguarding the asset and associated endowments, meeting the BNG ecological requirements, ensuring effective, appropriate long-term use by the Fishing Club, ensuring that public access and promoting the whole health and well-being for those people using the site, stakeholder participation, efficient day-to-day management, and underpinning all of that must be accountability and, of course, sustainability, particularly the economic sustainability for this going forward. Next slide, please. Now, I won't go into these in detail, but just to say the approach we take is to say, OK, what are the options? how could this be managed? How does that work? And I just want to set these out before we go into the recommendations. So first of all, the usual solution in the past has been about adoption, but that's not a brief we've been given here, and we believe that Cambridge City Council don't want to take full ownership or adopt this site. Therefore, we're looking then potentially at a bespoke new local organisation, and those could be a private company, or they could be a local trust model, and I'll come back to that in a second. Or third option, main category, is otherwise to outsource it to the likes of the Land Trust or the Wildlife Trust or the Fishing Club or other local body who essentially then take ownership and control. If we go to the next slide, I want to summarise our recommended strategy in the light of that. Now, our view is, and of course this is, I stress, subject to testing and consultation, not just with yourselves as members, but the local authority partners and of course community representatives. So we would like to have further discussion around this, but our suggestion and my recommendation to the client is that we should establish a standalone trust. The name can be changed obviously, but let's assume Coldham's Lane Trust. It's a charitable body. And that would have key stakeholders participating, fishing clubs, stakeholder volunteers, and of course, landscape management underpinning that, which is why it's a sort of green box underneath that, but with stakeholder advisory group feeding into that. If you go next slide, please. We think it would start off at a relatively small scale, so a core group of trustees from Anderson, from Mission Street and Cambridge City Council, and then over time evolving to then include community representation and the fishing club. That can be adapted and flexed, of course, but we think the idea is not to create a big body of people, but a small group of people able just to take decisions, oversee this, probably meeting maybe a couple of times a year, just to make sure it's doing what it should do and make appropriate appointments. Next slide, please. And therefore, next steps is a series of steps here. So stage one essentially is to agree to Section 106, consult with the key stakeholders and prepare and implement that management strategy, and preparing the financial model and annual budget through that process. Then we can be establishing a shadow board once all that's agreed, preparing those articles of association, register the trust, and make those first appointments and get it all set up properly, and then do that process, develop a community engagement strategy. And in the meantime, take on the operational responsibility and prepare and agree the financial procedures, open the bank account, etc., and then essentially take on full ownership and responsibility, updating the budget, producing the accounts, and so on. But if we go to the next slide, I just want to set in place the final reflection that actually my recommendation would be that actually, given some of the challenges around this site, that actually we have a 2-year pilot scheme, which I think could help to manage some of these risks out in that early period. So we know already Anderson, of course, had been managing this site for some time, but under these new arrangements, once it's all prepared and enhanced, we think, and the work's completed, it would be probably best for the developers to manage the site on a day-to-day basis and put those management arrangements we just discussed into effect. That way we can then check and compare the budgets we've set out with the revenue funding required, and just to make sure that those budgets are meeting according to the parameters that we've set out, and those can be then double checked and reviewed through that process. So thank you, Stuart and Tim. That's what I wanted to share as part of this proposal. Happy to take any questions or comments, but that was the background and reflection here. So I'll hand over to you guys. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. If it's okay, Stuart, we'll now ask members. I see Councillor Bajan's got his hand up. Dave, you're on. I think you're on mute. If you want to unmute.
Sorry.
There we go.
Got that one wrong. I'm Dave Bajan. I'm one of the local councillors for Romsey. I've been involved in trying to get these lakes open for 10 years under the right circumstances. I've got a couple of questions right at the beginning. There's a lot of concern about the people on Burnside. They're concerned about how their life's going to be changed by this. There's a lot of concern by the residents of Romsey, which in vast numbers have visited on the 3 occasions that I opened the lakes for the day, in their thousands. There would be a majority feeling that these lakes should be open. There's concern about the bio stuff, about the nature, how much it's going to be affected. I have some concerns about this fishing club, the prominence that this is given. I'd like to know the membership of the fishing club, how many people, where they come from, because I understand it was kept very exclusive and people were not allowed to join. And I think that the one thing that we must not forget, all the other things maybe will get pushed to one side to a certain extent, but we must work out how we're going to allow for people to swim in these lakes, because they're going to swim in them. And there's nothing to stop that. So we need some really careful thought made about where would be a good site for people to swim and how can we try and keep that as safe as possible. So that's a good start, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Mark, and Stuart and Tim, I'll hand over you to kind of deal with those questions in whichever order you want to take them. Thank you.
Tim, do you want to start off particularly about the fishing club? Because I know you're the ones that's been dealing with them and probably have got the best place to sort of know about how they work, etc., and membership. Is that okay? At least in the first instance.
Yeah, of course it is. Sure. Hi, Councillor Bajan. Thanks for the questions. On the fishing club, I think it's a fine balancing act, because on the one hand you do have what is a relatively exclusive club, so I appreciate there's sort of a democratic point to be had there, but at the same time the club to date have proved themselves to be pretty good custodians of the lakes and the facilities. So I think there's probably a middle ground to be struck where they, you know, continue to operate perhaps on slightly different terms, because they are going to, I think, be the natural kind of, you know, day-to-day people on the ground, making sure that the place is functioning properly. In terms of nature, I think, again, there's a fine, you know, we've struck the sensible balance here between having elements of the lake, the most sensitive parts where it is shallow enough for emergent vegetation, that is kind of sheltered from sort of the western lake, where there'll be more recreational walking and activity going on. Also within the mix, we obviously have the measures going on Parcel B to safeguard biodiversity. There are sort of wider measures that I think could be brought to the fore to better protect the residents of, you know, Burnside and Romsey more generally. You know, there has always been long concern about, you know, parking and so on and so forth. But I think the key thing in that regard is to make sure that this is quite a passive urban country park, as opposed to something that has loads of attractors to have kind of lots of prime time movements of families coming in and out. So, you know, what's being provided for and planned for through the plans, I think that sort of should take care of itself. And then in relation to, you know, allowing people to swim, I would say that's probably the type of day-to-day operational decision that the trust or the management body would be empowered to take. And it could take it having regard to all the feedback from the local residents and taking soundings from the likely demand from people for that type of activity. That's sort of my initial feedback on those four elements, Councillor Bajan.
Thank you. I won't come back. I just want to make the point, though, that this needs to be democratically controlled. We don't want to give the fishing club absolute veto on anything here. They've done a great job, but they've kept it exclusively for the members of the fishing club, and nobody else has been allowed to go there. So that is a real difficulty. And I think the Burnside and the swimming, somebody needs to make a decision about the swimming at this level, because people will swim in these lakes. There will be probably hardly anybody who's got any interest in these lakes, whether they're against them or for them, who haven't swum in them already. And so people will continue to swim. So this needs to be taken at this level, a policy decision. Thank you for answering the question.
I could just quickly pick up on that first one. Actually, you'll notice that my proposal around the governance structure is that the fishing club had one of potentially 5 or 6 places, whatever. We can determine the precise numbers, but absolutely agree. A whole key feature for me of this is what I call multi-stakeholder boards. So you never have one group actually having majority control. So that's the whole point of a stakeholder group here. And I totally agree with Tim as well. The idea then of having this representative group could actually take a view then about the nature of the activities taking place. and then set up associated policies, and of course making sure they're appropriately insured as well. I mean, that's part of the public liability insurance and these other responsibilities. So it does need proper governance and proper planning, and then risk assessments put in place for whatever activities are taking place and worked through. But thank you for those questions.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Councillor Ashton.
Thank you. I don't expect answers. It's just observations, and then people can think about what they're going to do about these things. First off is the timeline. Obviously, this has been going on for so many years now. I think it'd be interested to know when we think work could be started, when they would be open to the public. The second one is on ownership, because we're all aware it's not just Anderson's council, city council have part of those lakes as well, and Peterhouse have some scrubland at the back, which has caused major problems for trespassing. That leads me on to the ASB on the site. Tim knows very well we've been blighted in Cherryington for years with trespassing, damage to the stream, cutting the fences, allotments being wrecked. So this is going to carry on till we get this sorted out. So what plans are we putting in place? And finally, access as well. You've mentioned access points, the Tins and Burnside, but Snaky Path is already a very dangerous path. We've got problems with limited width, so increased pedestrians, cycles, scooters and mopeds. We've already had people who were forced into the stream by the volumes of traffic going down. So these are concerns I have. And again, you know, Dave mentioned problems with Burnside people. You know, Cherryington, Dawes Lane, St. Bede's Gardens, the parkings there have been unbelievable. Inflatable bridges put across to get access as well. So we still have a major concern with ASB on that site, and I'd like to know how that's going to be dealt with while we get this sorted out. Thank you.
Okay. Can I pick up the timing bit first, then perhaps handing over to Tim? So as far as the timing goes, Councillor Ashton, I mean, we're keen to get on with it, basically, and I know for a fact Tim will talk about from his perspective when I hand over in a minute. But I mean, broadly speaking, the idea is that once we've gone to committee and hope to get a resolution to grant and have a consent, we then have a series of pre-commencement conditions that we've got to clear, and we'll work through those. And we would be looking to start the actual works to deliver both the Parcel C and to commence the habitat creation to align with when we actually start the development on Parcel A. Now, obviously, in terms of timeframes, the Parcel C works would take a lot less time to actually deliver than even our first phase on Parcel A. So we would see that the actual Parcel C would be an operating facility and open way ahead of actually us occupying even the first phase buildings on Parcel A, because we're quite keen to just be moving on with it and trying to deliver the facility as quickly as possible. I know Tim has feelings about actually how, in terms of management terms, it's easier to manage once it's open. But Tim will talk more articulately than I on that. If I could hand over to you, Tim.
Yeah, Stuart, absolutely right. I mean, Councillor Ashton, the sooner the better from our perspective as a business, and no doubt organisationally for Cambridge City Council as kind of a co-landowner. We've both got sort of a joint interest in getting this resolved. There's two drivers really. One, it's an amazing space, and I think it warrants everybody having access. I mean, you walk onto that site, and I have walked every inch of the lakes, and it's just phenomenal. And I think people will really buy into having that on their doorsteps as a place that they can enjoy it and take care of. But the second driver is that the moment it's open, the antisocial behaviour incentive falls away. And from an insurance point of view, just from a safety point of view, we want to get this resolved as quickly as possible, because we know what happens when the weather gets warmer and in the type of activity that goes on without that kind of passive surveillance going on that you get when you have more people able to access freely. So as soon as possible, as Stuart says, I'll completely echo that. The moment we are able to get on with the works, we will get on with the works. We have already, as you may be aware, tail end of last year, put up fencing along the whole of the southern edge to Snaky Path. That's actually gone in really well. It looks attractive. It's acting as a better deterrent than the wire mesh fencing before. It's easier to replace. And along the whole eastern boundary as well, we've reinforced the security there. So we do take it very, very seriously, and we're on standby to respond to instances going forward. But the quicker we can get this put into a long-term sustainable position, we will get on with that. And I expect the triggers that Toby and colleagues and yourselves will put in place will reflect that as well.
I think the last point then was about the stewardship and the ownership. Because obviously the local authority do own sections of the lakes as well. I mean, before we do that, I'll hand over to Mark, who can talk a bit about that in the structure. As far as Peterhouse, whatever we're looking at doing here doesn't preclude Peterhouse being involved and all of the lakes being opened up. So that would be welcome. Up until now, Peterhouse have been passive on that, and I understand, Tim has worked on this for sort of like 10 years, except that has always been the case. Having said that, if ever that was to change, then the structures that we'll put in place are very flexible, that we could open up further, and they could be part of the custodianship as well. Is there anything, Mark, that you wanted to sort of say about the structure and how the local authority could engage in that? Because there's all sorts of options there as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so that's to be explored further. The ideal situation is no doubt is that all of the ownership sits with one body, but that's not always as easy to secure. So whether then there's sort of formal legal agreements, if one party puts the ownership in, but another one gives the lease arrangements or whatever. So it's to be worked through. At the end of the day, the most important thing, of course, is that there's consistent management, and it's one management solution. Everybody's signing up to that, a party to it, and therefore I'd ideally like them to be part of that governance body. But the other side of it, I didn't mention properly actually when I talked about that stakeholder advisory group. That's the other key party, so other people and other wider interests can actually participate and give advice and support. And from my experience, that usually is what happens. Actually, most people want to have a say in these things, but don't actually want to take the responsibility. So actually having the ability for wider groups of people and residents and other representatives and other stakeholders to have a say and can feed into that small board to make the decisions is the ideal situation. But those details need to be still worked through, Stuart.
Great, thanks, Mark. I think we've got some other questions. I see Councillor Bajan also has kind of posted a comment saying that the opening of the lakes will need planning permission but sign off by the politicians. So just to be clear to members, the lakes and the works within the lakes are within the red line of the application. So that is what's going to come together with the R&D to a committee at some point in the future. We are currently targeting the 4th of September as the planning committee when this application is going to come for committee's consideration. Right, Councillor Thornborough.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got three sort of points and questions. One is BNG on this site. I know that we've got the mandatory increase in BNG, and we've got an aspiration to do more, but that may still leave the sites quite below what their full potential is for BNG. So would this be an opportunity to be a BNG site for other developers to invest in BNG? I don't know whether that would help the reaching the maximum BNG or optimum nature on the sites, and whether that might help funding. That's one question. Another is how much of what is being presented today it will be material considerations at the planning application. A third point or question, it follows on a bit from Councillor Ashton and Bajan, is really what type of real engagement has already been carried out with residents and local businesses and organisations, for example, the local schools. That'd be interesting. And finally, if this is achieved, would it be possible to learn from this process? Because there are two more lakes. There's a Barnwell Lake and there's an adjacent lake, and there's some land next to Parcel B that maybe could be the the green area for Parcel B, maybe that could be included to extend and include that in the future. So if this process, if it's successful, could be considered an exemplar. Thank you.
Okay. To try and take some of those in turn. I probably would look to Richard Stantec to correct me if I've got this wrong, but in terms of the way that the BNG assessment has been put together, we've looked at all three sites coming together and done the assessments with all three coming together, including the off-site contributions, etc. And if I've remembered this correctly, I think we're somewhere in the region of an uplift of 23%. I think it's something like that, Richard. Is that about right? I think the current policy is a minimum of 10. There's an aspiration of 20. So we're the current assessment is we're looking to hit that. Of course, we've got to assess that over the 30-year period, etc., and work with officers to make sure we actually achieve that. But we think we're in a good place, and obviously the habitat creation that we're doing on Parcel B is really key to that. So I think it's a good baseline and a good starting point. We just need to sort of be able to deliver that over the 30-year period. It's an interesting point you make about the possibility for other developers to contribute. I haven't actually considered that, but I'll definitely go away and think about that, because I think there, if we could identify opportunities there, that would be great. But I'll have to take that one away, Councillor, at the moment, because it's a good idea that it's never occurred to me. So thank you for that. As far as consultation and engagement, we've done lots and lots of, and I won't bore you too much about that, but I think we've had 3 public exhibitions, but we've had countless various meetings with all of the key stakeholders. We've actually got more programmed in between now and committee, but to talk about particularly the funding and management streams that we'll be having. So we'll be going back to the fishermen again. We have already spoken to the fishing club to sort of, because whilst they're not the only show in town, as has been clear, I think they have been an important custodian, and we would like them to be involved. But ditto Friends of Cherry Hinton Brook, etc. So we will be going back out with them because we think it's important, and we'll be doing all of that again before committee. In terms of school engagement, we worked closely with Bonnie Kwok and her team in terms of the school engagement. We were down at the Spinney. We did lots of stuff there. We went down and visited the school. There was lots of competitions for the design for furniture that can actually be incorporated, and bird boxes and badger boxes, etc. We did a site visit where the children sort of got a chance to understand what we were trying to do in ecological terms and engage with that. They've done lots of really cool stuff that we'll be sort of manufacturing and placing within both the lakes area, but also in terms of the Parcel B and bird boxes and the like as well. So I could go on there because it's probably the most fun bit of my job actually over the last year, and the engagement with Bonnie and her team was fantastic. But yes, we've done lots and we'll continue to do more. Have I missed anything there? I think the exemplar bit would be a great opportunity actually. I mean, if we do get this right, we'd be more than happy to sort of roll that out. I'm not sure quite how that would work, but I'd sort of seek advice from officers perhaps of where they've done this sort of thing before, where they've got exemplar schemes. But yeah, we'd be more than happy to try and contribute to that. Well, I mean, I'll go, Tim, have you got any more thoughts on any of that?
Well, I was just going to come in on that final point, Stuart, because I totally agree. Reputationally, for the 3 main parties here today, which are myself, Stuart and Mark as well, and his organisation. Mark wouldn't have taken this instruction if in any way he didn't have, total faith in our ability to deliver, because, ultimately delivering on this is what he does, and he wants to be able to showcase this as, proof of the structures that he recommends, advocates, and puts in place. So it's a massive opportunity for the 3 of us and for the council as very much a partner within this. So very, very optimistic about it for sure, and becoming an exemplar. And I used to fish Barnwell Lakes as a kid, so it was funny hearing that one. I can see it rolling out to there as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and I could just quickly add to that. Actually, I think a couple of things. First, actually, I was first involved. I think I can't remember how many years ago it was, Tim, but there was a original consultation about some early scheme, and we had a whole weekend. Some of you might remember that, when actually we had all sorts of stakeholders and we were involved over a couple of days. And so the idea about a local trust and actually the representatives of various different stakeholders was part of that. And I certainly was part of some of those discussions originally when we looked at that. And the other point is that in terms of what I call quality stewardship, and you might be familiar with other schemes across the Cambridge area, actually where you've got partnership arrangements, but actually some form of endowment going in, not just residents making contributions or relying just on council tax or otherwise, is a key means by which you can actually, if you like, not just take the asset itself, but actually put capital in to say this is going to fund this in the long term. And of course, that's over and above any capital the developers are going to be putting in to actually build the things in the first place, which will obviously have to be done to meet the standards and be fully fit for purpose. So I think this is a great example of what, and I really hope, but I'm really glad you also touched on not just the outcome, but actually the process, Councillor Thornborough. That's really important. Get the process right. That's equally important to getting this the right solution, but also in terms of best practice as well. So yeah, thanks for recognising that.
Thanks, Mark. On process, I would say we've just been kind of given the kind of draft management framework, which is going to be subject to a kind of last round of consultation in July, Councillor Thornborough. That is going to inform the planning report. The actual kind of final detailed sign off will be through the Section 106 process, and you heard Mark talk about a 2-year pilot. I think that's quite important so that we can kind of with the knowledge of how much it's cost, kind of settle some of those finances to make sure that it's a sustainable management model that is actually implemented in the long term. I will now turn to Councillor Bennett.
Thank you. Before I start, Katie, have you happy with that, or do you need to follow anything up? Thank you. I've got 3 points. The first one is Councillor Ashton has already briefed me some time ago on the ASB issues in that particular area. We have very similar problems in Riverside, in Abbey, and I'd like to put in the plea for you to consider a CCTV scheme on the lines of one adopted in Central Park, Peterborough. It's unrealistic to expect the police to be able to put in resource that's needed for such a large rural area to keep it safe, considering the other demands on their time. You need to basically invest in some Central Park style CCTV, solar powered, disguised, and that money is going to have to come from developers because we haven't been able to get it for any of our rural areas from the PCC. I'm sure that if you do that, it will pay for itself in terms of reduced ASB and catching up on issues quickly before they take root. The second thing is the management body. It's considering how long-term these arrangements are going to need to be, it's usually best practice to try and partner with an existing body such as a wildlife trust, because there's a better chance that it will stay in existence during the long period. And I just wondered why you hadn't considered the alternative of a sub-fund with a non-exclusive licence and a subcommittee of an established body like the Wildlife Trust. That would also speed things up. It can take over a year to get a bank account for a new charity. So that's question 2. Question 3 is, I'm aware of the historic contamination in the lakes, and I'd just like to ask, is it your considered view that the best thing is to leave that in place, and is that a totally safe issue? Or should there be an active plan to remedy the historic contamination from unauthorised and unrecorded dumping? Thank you. Those are my three questions. I'm not expecting answers immediately necessarily, given how many other councillors are waiting, and I'd be happy for an answer afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. I think we can pick up all of those, but as you say, bearing in mind time, perhaps if we will drop you a line on all those, because I think we've got good answers for all of those, and maybe take the other questions, if that's okay with you, Toby.
Stuart, I certainly would just on the first one say, there's no reason why provision couldn't be made for CCTV, whether that's implemented in day one or it comes on stream later. It's not a massively expensive endeavour, and so I think that would be, appropriate and right to make sure that that's embedded within the startup costs.
And I'd just like to quickly comment actually on that second point. Actually, we did consider that, and I have to say it's a judgment call we've made, but I hope and believe it's the right one, that actually there's a lot of local interest here, not just from obviously the resident side, but also the fishing club side, that actually I believe that a local management arrangement is the right solution in this instance. Through the 2-year period, we've obviously allowed for factors like, yes, you're right, it does take a while to get charitable status and open a bank account, but we've allowed for that in that period and having this sort of dual process. And I would just counter to say that I've got experience on the other side, where sometimes it does work to put it to a regional or national body, but I have one particular site where there's actually been pushback from local people saying, look, we really want to have a proper stake in this one and we can't because it's already been gifted or passed over to a wider body which has wider objectives and actually doesn't have that local parochial interest. So yes, it's a judgment call, and so often developers do that because it's easier and cleaner to put it to a bigger body and a safer body, but actually I think believe it in this instance, it is worth the effort to actually invest in that to get local ownership, given particularly the strength of the local stakeholders participating and indeed yourselves. And I think demonstrated even by the number of members on this call. So I think it's the right answer, but we can discuss that further if there's a real belief in it's not the right solution.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And I think it goes without saying, I think we've got a representative from Cambridge, past, present, future in this meeting listening in. I have asked Mission Street also to engage with the CPPF and also the Wildlife Trust for some feedback on the draft framework. I think it's important to gain their insights as well in this process. For the time being, Councillor Bennett, does that kind of satisfy your questions? I know there was the third question around contamination is a bit more detailed in terms of the expertise. We might not have that in the meeting today,
I'm
but
quite
the developers,
happy.
yeah, okay, fine, great, okay. Councillor Smart.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. So yeah, my name's Martin. I'm a city councillor. I'm on planning committee, so I'm not so familiar with the site as maybe Councillor Bajan or Councillor Ashton or others may be. I mean, my memory of the site, for what it's worth, is cycling along about 15 or 20 years ago from the end of Mill Road to Booker's wholesale warehouse, shopping with a trailer bike, and I'd sort of peek through the fence and see the lakes, and that led to sort of being familiar with them, and then coming to meetings. I remember in the Guildhall that Councillor Bajan organised about this site. So I've limited understanding, and I found your presentation useful, but I thought it could have been better, actually. The thing is these online meetings mean that we're looking at very small screens. Looking at parcels A, B and C is of limited use when I can't really see them very well, and the parcels didn't seem to be outlined, so I couldn't really see where the extent of the parcel was. I think this meeting would have been better in person. So just to get to, I mean, I'm going to speak for a couple of minutes and there will be a question there. So the sort of substantive of my question or point really is that you seem to be putting forward some wonderful proposals for development, but you want somebody else to bear the cost, responsibility and liability for those things. Now, I wonder if strategically there seems to be an error of judgment there in terms of us all considering that on that basis. There are probably other ways forward. That may be a question for Toby rather than you, because obviously you have skin in the game in terms of that question. I'm also not even sure that they are wonderful proposals. I've not heard a great deal in terms of resident demand for this. I've heard a fair bit in terms of some councillors demanding it, and clearly you are, in terms of putting this forward. The sort of adjunct to that point really is that you've talked a lot about money in this presentation, and that was quite interesting. We don't normally talk about money in planning. It's not normally a planning matter, and that may be a matter for Toby as well. So you've presented one side of the balance sheet, so the costs, not the income. You're going to get income, so that's a consideration, but it probably won't be a consideration when we consider a planning item in planning committee, and I presume it'll come to committee. So, and just on that, just on the detail of that, I wasn't quite clear on the endowment proposals, whether there's any suggestion that would be in perpetuity or just for fixed periods of time, and if so, what happens at the end of that period of time? So was it intended that the endowments would be spent over that period, or was it intended that they would continue on? I think finally, just to pick up on Councillor Bajent's point about swimming in the lakes, which is, I know, something he's talked about before, and sort of I think as an example, it's a part of things that people might like to do with the lakes, I think. And you never answer that question. So I'm presuming the answer is no, they can't swim in the lakes, because I know that there's a clash there between people swimming and people fishing. And this whole question of the fishing club is the elephant in the room that you're not really answering. So we can't be part of a scheme that is allowing a certain small section of the populace to take control of this land, so to the exclusion of others, so that others can get benefit from it. So it needs to be borne in mind that there are several contributing factors here, and the fishing club can't have everything. And I said that was finally, but there was one final point. The idea of the Wildlife Trust was suggested. So the other thing, perhaps, and again, I don't really know too much about it, but to be borne in mind that we have the CAM, I think Conservatives of the River Cam, that seem to me, from my experience and knowledge of what they do, to be a similar sort of organisation. So I don't know if they might play a part in all of this as well. But I do think, and again, finally, that the suggestion of the Wildlife Trust might be useful in terms of getting away from that provincial, parochial feeling about the fisher people being in charge here. That's not going to be the case, is it? That can't be the case. It has to be for everyone, not, for the many, not the few. Okay, thanks, Toby.
Thanks, Stuart, Timothy, or Mark. Do you want
Should I pick up on this to start with?
Yeah.
Let me just make an initial response. So first of all, Councillor Smart, apologies if I wasn't clear at all here. The reason I'm involved is we're working all the time with both developers and local authorities on what I call long-term stewardship solutions, and it must be in perpetuity. And a key feature always for whenever I'm briefing local members and planning committees and others is they want to make sure this is sustainable. And that means, as we say, the process I went through, setting out roles, responsibilities, setting out what the costs are, but also then where does that money come from? And so again, apologies I wasn't clear. The endowment figures that we've come up with are an in perpetuity solution designed to deliver the revenues required to meet those costs that we've outlined, and that endowment will be provided by the developers. So it's not them passing it off and getting money in from someone else. No, it's them putting the capital in, not only to build those lakes out to the standards, but also to make sure the revenues are there in the long term. And so we've had someone with experience of treasury management look at that. So we factored in the inflation, the returns you get, and that is an endowment that will make that work. So that's the first point. And apologies if I wasn't clear about that. So this definitely is an in perpetuity solution and at a cost to the developers. And the second point is we're absolutely clear that, of course, the fishing club are an important user here, but they will not be in control. This is about a shared multi-stakeholder group to meet the needs acceptance of a range of users, and particularly by volume numbers. Of course, it will be the local residents that are using it to walk, cycle, enjoy, and so on. And we didn't rule out the swimming. What we said was this needs to be looked at properly and carefully, because there are clearly health and safety and insurance risks associated with it. It must be done properly and therefore designed in by that group. So maybe a couple of other points that others want to pick up on, but those are the key things, and apologies I wasn't clear in the first place.
Good. Stuart, Timothy, were there any other points you wanted to come back to Martin on?
No, thanks. So I think Mark covered it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a developer-funded solution as opposed to requiring any other sources of income. Obviously, if there are other sources of income and in-kind contributions, then so much the better. It just reinforces the robustness of the solution and so forth. But yeah, not looking for anything further.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Tim. Martin, does that satisfy you for now in terms of the answers, the generality of the answers?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. You don't need to apologise, by the way. It's fine. I think the thing is that these sorts of high-level meetings, I think you need to be absolutely clear what you are and aren't putting on the table rather than beating around the bush. So these questions of swimming, those sorts of difficult questions need to be bottomed out at this stage, because there's no point trying to pretend they're not problems, because they are, and we need to be clear what's on offer. And Toby, about the money side of things, so where is planning and all of that? Normally we don't talk about the costs of things in planning. So do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much material, Martin. In this case, there's a specific policy within the allocation that talks about the developer having to put forward a kind of draft management plan for the lakes, and for the authority to feel confident that it can grant planning permission, it needs to be absolutely sure that the new kind of country park has got the necessary funding and management regime in place for it to be a success. Because if it fails, then we're left with a development and no kind of public benefit in terms of the access to the lake. So it's got to be absolutely right, and that does involve an analysis with colleagues. We've been talking to Alistair Wilson, and external review of what's being put forward by the developer. We don't want to be left with a situation where, for whatever reason, the management of the lakes has not been properly accounted for, and public access stops after a few years. It's got to be sustainable. So it is really, really important for the council to be kind of confident in this space.
Okay, thanks, Toby. But just to follow up on that then, I mean, obviously money isn't everything. It is the bottom line, but it isn't everything. But just in terms of the money then, will we get some kind of input into the planning meeting when this item comes? We talk about viability studies for, say, housing developments and so on. Will we get some financial input on that? Because if that's so critical, then, we're just amateurs, aren't we, in that game? And if we don't get some sort of serious input about the robustness of these calculations and projections for financial viability going forward, then we're lost, aren't we?
Well, absolutely. So, before this meeting, we've already met with Alistair Wilson, who heads up the management of the City Council's open spaces, and he and his team have a good understanding of how much that costs. You've heard Mark talk about the kind of comparative sites that his firm have been working on. We've also been talking to property colleagues, and as I said, I think we'll be getting some feedback also from Cambridge Past, Present, Future, the Wildlife Trust, and possibly also the RSPB. I'm not too sure about the CAM Conservatives. So there will be kind of multi-stakeholder feedback into those costs. And as I said, the suggestion is that there will be a kind of 2-year pilot process, so we can ensure that when those costs are more fully known on a kind of year by year basis, they can then be kind of baked into the final financial model. So that's where we're headed, Martin. I'd like to think that when we land at committee, members can feel confident with the developers and also the officers that we've got a really kind of good framework to work from.
Yeah, okay. So I know you want to go on. There's other councillors. Just answer this bit. But the thing I was really alluding to, that what you just said, but also expert financial advice, which we don't have at council particularly in this regard. That was what I'm getting at. But thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Right, Councillor Dryden.
Okay, thanks. Most of my questions have probably been answered now. But there's one thing I am going to say in defence of the fishing club. They've been running the club there for many years, and I know quite a few of them in the past because they all live in the Cherrington area, and they're not exclusive. The reasons that they can't have so many members because you can't have over too many people fishing the small lake, and that's the reason why some people have tried to join. There's a waiting list to join. So it's not exclusive, and I don't think fishing and the swimming has already been said. I think we would, if we allow that to be a swimming area, there's going to be a lot of health and safety issues here. That's why they don't allow it in other places where there's lakes in the Cambridgeshire area. So that's it. Thank you. Not a question, just a comment. Sorry.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Rob. So I think we've got. I think we've got Dave Bagent with his hand up, and I think we'll draw it to a close. Dave?
Sorry, I'm going to just speak a bit more about what I said earlier and what Martin was saying. The swimming needs to be solved before it comes to planning committee. I think that. I can't tell you what my decision would be at planning committee, but it appears to me as a politician to be a red line. People will swim in the lakes. We have antisocial behaviour breaking into the lakes because people want to swim, not for many other reasons. You need to understand this. It's no good telling us that you're putting it off, because you might find that is a real pitfall. I would emphasise that we would like to see lots of cycle parking. We need lots of cycle parking, and we need an answer to what happens when people turn up in cars. That needs to be taken into account. As regards to the fishing club and Rob Dryden's thing, you can see there's some sort of conflict here. A small exclusive group have looked after the lakes for a number of years, and they've done a fantastic job at that. But they are not the arbitrators here, and there may well be some resistance. Fishing is not universally an acceptable behaviour. It's a cruel sport. It's controversial. People stocking up somewhere and then sticking hooks in fish's mouths is not altogether an acceptable behaviour by a lot of people. So I think that you need to look at, amongst everything else, what local support will be for this. There's people on Burnside who've got a really, really clear idea. They're very into nature. The very fact that they live there makes them into nature. But then there's 2,000 people that visited on the 3 days that I opened this up. And as one of you said, it has to be seen to be believed. This is an area of leisure that should be open to the people of Cambridge, arriving by active transport at this site. So I just hope you can hear what I'm trying to, the red lines perhaps that I'm even drawing for you. I'm pushing at the edge of my responsibility as a planner, but I'm also talking as a politician for the area that currently has access to is the only area with legal access to the lakes. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Bagent. Stuart, Mark, Tim, did you want to kind of comment any more over this kind of swimming question in particular?
I think the baseline for the start of the management of the facility is that swimming wouldn't be encouraged. However, that is, you know, and it's largely a health and safety issue, I think. Now, that's not to say that that needs to be the case in perpetuity. And I think, you know, part of the 2-year trial and part of that is that's really good because it helps us do our own due diligence with the council in terms of how much things are going to cost. But it also helps us to understand through stakeholders what the demand is, how people want to use it, how people are using it. And I think it's something that can be sort of taken on advisement as we see how the actual facility is utilised going forward. But I think as the starting point, I think the assumption is that that swimming it wouldn't be something that is that is acceptable. But it's something that could be considered in the future. But and if it was, we'd have to take proper account to make sure that it was perfectly safe for all concerned.
You need to have an answer for that before it comes to planning. You do. You really do.
Okay.
I would just add, Councillor Page, one of the comments is asking about Milton Country Park. I think Councillor Ashton asked that. I think it is, but it's kind of done very in a controlled manner, you know, formal sessions overseen by, you know, instructors and the rest of it. So, you know, maybe, Stuart, there's something in that regard we could we could take on board.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. I think that's the end of the questions, and we've run out of time. There are some other comments in there that you might want to think about addressing later down the line, particularly one around snaky path and the ability to kind of improve. I think it's width, but that's you know, Stuart, Mark, Tim, and rest of the team, thank you so much for presenting it. It is a really important kind of part of this planning application that you need to get right and members need to feel confident with. There's a suggestion that there needs to be a site visit before planning committee. I'll make sure that we date is settled for that well in advance of committee, so members can understand contextually kind of how big this space is. The lakes and the spaces around them are significant. So that's really important. Okay, great. Unless anyone's got any other questions, then I'll call the meeting to a close. Thanks to everyone that's attended, and particularly the councillors. I know it's you know, early Monday morning after a long weekend, but thank you for attending. Good attendance, really good questions, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for briefing us.
Pleasure. Thanks for all the comments, everybody. It's really useful.